A reading from Luke chapter 3, beginning at the first verse. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Ituraea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of the God came to John the son of Zechariah in the wilderness, and he went into all the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. As it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall become straight, and the rough places shall become level ways, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God." When you read through Luke's Gospel, and these are words quite early on in chapter 3, you get a sense that Luke is a man who really wanted to do everything properly. He wanted to research things. He wanted to get it right. He wanted to be precise. And you can see this right from the beginning, because right at the beginning, he's saying he's setting out to give an orderly account. This is what this is all about. And there are parts of his Gospel which are unique to him. And that would suggest to us, reasonably enough, that he had his own sources. He had his own eyewitnesses. And when you think that many of the things which are unique to Luke's Gospel are to do with the birth of Christ, well, then you can only assume that one of his eyewitness sources is none other than the Virgin Mary herself. So he's been doing his homework, and we can see that here, because he follows the ancient custom of doing dates by reference to who was reigning or holding office at the time. So we know who was emperor, high priest, tetrarch, all these things. They're there because he wants us to know precisely when John the Baptist began to preach. This is grounded in history. We also have sources outside of the Gospels, telling us about John the Baptist. What about this from Josephus, writing towards the end of the 1st century, a Jewish historian, no great friend of Christianity? He writes this of John the Baptist, that he commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that the washing with water would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. This is all historical stuff. We have sources within the Gospels. We have sources outside in the wider Jewish world. We have precise dating. It demonstrates the reality of all of this. And we need to remember this always. Because as the Apostle John memorably puts it, Jesus took flesh and dwelt among us. This is not some private revelation. This is not something happening in secret. Jesus took flesh and dwelt among us, surrounded by eyewitnesses. This is God stepping into the flow of history, not some vision or phantasm or impression. He steps in. Elsewhere, John writes in his first letter, right at the beginning, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands." And he carries on. But do you get it? He's saying we saw this, we heard him, we touched him. This is real. The second context, though, not the historical one, is a theological one. And Luke is keen on that as well, because historical acts do have theological significance. And this is true for John the Baptist's ministry here. He's not a lone agent, but he's fulfilling purposes long laid out. He takes his own decisions, yes, but he's carried along by the deeper currents of the will of God. He goes into the wilderness, which makes up so much of ancient Israel's history, and preaches a baptism of repentance. and in so doing, he becomes the subject of Isaiah's centuries-old prophecy. The preacher is transformed into the forerunner of the Messiah, and so his preaching takes on a more significant tone. The repentance that he's speaking about now has eternal consequences. And so it is that Luke points us to Isaiah. And in so doing, Luke serves to provide a rich theological context for Jesus' own ministry. Because Isaiah itself is so full of prophecies of the Messiah and of Christ that it's known by many as the fifth gospel. Isaiah 7:14, well, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. Isaiah 11 talks about the lineage of Jesus. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Jesse is David's father. Jesus is David's descendants. It's in his family tree. Isaiah 61, speaking of the message of Jesus, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Well, then speaking of the things that Jesus did, Isaiah 35, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Isaiah 6, and he said, go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Even Jesus' rejection by many is foretold. Isaiah 8, and he shall become a sanctuary and a stone of offence and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. He's a stumbling block to many, which is why so many sought his death. Again, all prophesied in Isaiah. This is the theological context for Jesus. We have historical, we also have theological. But there's more. Famously, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, speaking of Jesus' crucifixion. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. And going on, speaking of his burial, and they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. And so with this theological context, we have to ask ourselves the question, if Jesus was a fraud, he could no more choose the place of his burial than he could of his womb. We have to say to ourselves, if this is prophesied long centuries before, well then Jesus' fulfilment speaks of much more than simply history. There's many more. I've only given a flavour. And so it is vital that we read the New Testament against the context of the Old Testament, that the life and ministry of Christ is understood against these two lenses. We may place him in the flow of history, the God who dwelt among us, the God who took flesh and dwelt among us. And as such, Jesus has a date of birth. But the second lens is wide-angled. It places Jesus in the sweep of Old Testament and shows us the significance of that taking flesh that he did. It presents Jesus as the long-looked-for Messiah, and it shows that all his actions are theological. With him, you see, with Jesus, you see, the question is not only when, the question is also why.